Hello, everyone. Sam here, and welcome to the very first episode of the Sanctum Reports. This is a new series I'm doing focused entirely around the Pulp character, the Shadow. I've been wanting to do this for a while. I actually shot a video about the Shadow about a month or two ago, but I didn't like the way the video was formatted, and so I kind of put it on the back burner for a while. And this is the one that I am releasing for a few different reasons. One, I really want to talk about the Shadow. The second reason is that later this month, PulpFest is happening, and they are actually hosting ShadowCon there, which is going to be focused around the Shadow. I am going to be helping out there for the Shadowed Circle, which is the shadow focus magazine that I work for. But I kind of decided, in order to drum up some interest and excitement for PulpFest and ShadowCon, I was going to do a couple of videos this month focused on the Shadow. It was mostly going to be just reviews of some of his stories, many of them that I've read recently. But I thought for the very first episode, I should do a primer video. I've done a primer video for Secret Agent X versus Dr. Death, so I figured why not do a primer video for the Shadow for anyone who is not that familiar with him. And one of the reasons I want to do this is that there are a lot of great videos here on YouTube talking about the Shadow. But there's a lot of them that I think don't really give people a good idea of the Shadow as a character and just his general history, because a lot of them don't really go as much into his the background of his creation, and kind of just focus on the character himself. But even then, it's a very broad strokes information about him. So I wanted to do a video that talked about the character as well as his publishing history, because he actually has a very fascinating publishing history that can get a little convoluted, just because the Shadow came from a very different time and from very different mediums. So he's a bit hard to parse through if you don't know much about him. But that's the goal of this primer video, to give you some basics about the character and just let you know his general history as a character and as a franchise. So that's the main focus of this video, and it will also be the first video in what I'm going to call the road to Pope, not to Pope, the road to PulpFest, which will be my videos talking about certain PulpFest topics. There's going to be these panels and topics handled at PulpFest, and I wanted to talk about some of these topics before I go, especially the Shadow, given that ShadowCon is happening, and we want to make sure it's a big success. So, hopefully, if you don't know much about the Shadow, this will give you a good starting point for him. So, I guess we'll start. So, the Shadow, for those who don't know, is a pulp hero. And a pulp hero is a character who is published in a pulp magazine. And pulp magazines were basically the mass form of entertainment that ran from roughly 1896 to 1949. That's a rough estimate because there were some pulps that went into the 50s, but the 1890s to the late 1940s are generally considered the pulp magazine's major time. And The Shadow was arguably one of, if not the biggest, pulp hero in pulp magazine history. This is the reprint that was done by Sanctum Publications a couple of years ago. This collects two of The Shadow's adventures, Green Eyes and Grey Fist. These were both Chinatown stories. The Shadow has a big tie to Chinatown, as I'll tell you in a few minutes. But The Shadow was created in the 1930s, and he was really the one who jump-started the pulp hero craze. And pulp heroes were very much the predecessors to comic book heroes, because before comic books became popular and established, it was pulps that had a large number of heroes in their pages. And in a lot of ways, they kind of set the stage for the superhero boom in comic books, because pulp magazines were the medium that proved you could do a single character publication and have it be very successful. And more specifically, The Shadow was the one who proved that you could do a one character publication, because The Shadow was not the first pulp hero. There were other pulp heroes who had appeared in pulp magazines during the early part of pulp magazine's reign. You know, you had like Tarzan and Zorro, Solomon Kane, just all these characters who absolutely were well known and established within pulp magazines before The Shadow appeared anywhere. But the catch of that was that all of them were not in their own magazine. They were always like a serial in a bigger magazine. I think Tarzan was in like the All Story Weekly. Zorro was in a couple of different magazines, but they were never. They had the cover. They were listed as the cover story, but they were not. It was not the Tarzan magazine or the Zorro magazine. It was always some other publication. But The Shadow was the first one that really had his own devoted magazine. He was the main man. The magazine was named after him. His story was always the main draw. He was the man. To quote the movie Your Hunter from the Future, he's the man. So The Shadow is deeply important to not just pulp history, but arguably comic book history too. And generally, The Shadow is who most people think of when they think of the phrase pulp hero. You know, some people do think of like Tarzan or Zorro, but a lot of people think of The Shadow when they hear the phrase pulp hero, because he just kind of embodied all that sort of, for lack of a better term, pulpiness of that era of the 1930s and 40s. He was the main man, much like Lobo, and he just really set the stage for a lot of different heroes that would come later. So he is a major figure, and that's why you should absolutely be interested in his history. One thing I wanted to talk about is how I know about The Shadow, because as most of you can probably guess, I was not around in the 1930s or 1940s, so I was not around when The Shadow was at his peak. But I was aware of him because both of my parents had experienced him when they were in the United States Army. Because my parents were stationed in a United States military hospital in West Germany during the 1980s. And when they were there initially, they couldn't afford a television. So they had to get a radio. And because it was Germany, most of the radio stations were in German, not English. And one of the few exceptions was GI radio. And one of the things that GI radio played were these old comic, sorry, not comic, radio shows that were popular in the 30s and 40s. And that included The Shadow. You might have just went, well, wait, didn't you say The Shadow was a pulp character? He was a radio character too, and that's one of the important history facts we'll get back to later. So they had the Shadow, they had the Lone Ranger, they had the Saint, they had the Green Hornet, just all these radio characters. And for the first year or two that my parents were there, that was the entertainment they listened to until they could afford a television. And that was how I kind of knew about him, because my parents often talked about him. And when I was, I would say about 7 or 8, I saw the 1994 film of The Shadow starring Alec Baldwin. And occasionally on our local radio, there'd be occasional radio reruns. I remember them most often happening around Halloween, which makes sense for The Shadow. But that was the extent of my exposure to him as a kid. And I didn't really get as fully invested in him until around 2020. Because these reprints that I showed, were the Sanctum editions, they're often called. They started going out of print around 2020. Because James Patterson had gotten the rights to the Shadow character when he was doing his rendition of him. And one of the stipulations was that they didn't want any reprints conflicting with the new James Patterson version. So they had to stop printing these around 2020. And right about that time was when the pandemic was hitting. And I learned about all these Shadow books, and I was like, oh man, I should grab these before they go out of print. And so I did, and I read a lot of these while I was stuck in my dorm room over the summer of 2020. And that was how I really got into the pulp version of the character. And from there, I learned about the Shadowed Circle, which was a cultural magazine devoted to the Shadow. They were asking for some help. I hopped in to work as their web manager, and the rest is history. So that was kind of how I came into the Shadow. But I've talked about the Shadow, but I haven't really described him much. So, to get into some more specifics about the Shadow as a character, the Shadow is this guy you see right here. This man in black. And the whole thing about it is that the Shadow's costume is he wears this wide-brimmed black slouch hat. And that's important. It's a slouch hat. It's not a fedora. It's not a trilby. It's a slouch hat, like how a cavalry officer would wear. And this is because depending on the way he bends it, he can hide his eyes and hide his face if he's hiding in the darkness. And he also wears this black cloak that is crimson lined. That's why this flash of red is here. And the black cloak helps him obviously blend into the dark. And remember, this is the 1930s, where wearing a dark cloak was not all that unusual a fashion statement. So it was a costume that helped him hide, but it was also a costume that was very nondescript. Like, you wouldn't really look at anyone unusual wearing all black like this in 1930s New York. His main tool of fighting crime were good old-fashioned Colt 45s, which are pistols, for those that don't know guns. And he often fired them at criminals. And that was kind of his main device of enacting his punishment towards the guilty. Not his only, but it was as frequent. In fact, this the Colts is actually the reason I'm wearing this shirt. That Samuel Colt, the one who introduced Colt manufacturing. But the Colt 45s are his most famous weapon, but he actually had a host of other devices. The two most famous ones are these suction cups that he put on his hands and knees that allowed him to crawl up a wall, several decades before Spider-Man. And his other famous thing was something called the Devil's Whisper. And what this was there was these chemicals he put on the end of his fingers. And if some bad guy came up to him, he would snap right in their face, and the chemicals would explode and create this huge flash of light. And it wouldn't hurt his fingers, but it would hurt the bad guy's eyes. It'd be very disorienting. So that was one of his main weapons. Another thing that he was well known for is that he had a ring, and it was a jewel called a girasol. And the girasol ring was kind of his symbol. That's how his allies knew who he was, even if he didn't look like the Shadow. Because one of the things about the Shadow was that he was a master of disguise. He would look like many different people, and thus even some of his allies wouldn't really know who was him when he was in action. And frequently he would not tell them who he was. So, and of course the other thing is, like a lot of pulp heroes, the Shadow was very adept at martial arts. Judo is one that he is often listed as doing, but he quite obviously knew others like karate and certain kung fu moves. So he was a master martial artist in multiple martial arts. And the main premise of the Shadow is he's dressed in this way and he's fighting crime because he was a World War I veteran who had gone through the war and, had the typical lost generation dissatisfaction, to quote Ernest Hemingway. That 1920s lost generation style wanderlust and feeling of lack of purpose. But then he realized that there was another war to be waged, but this time it wasn't with the Germans, it was with crime, because 1920s is when the crime, of course, famously started escalating during Prohibition. And in the and by the late 20s, the Great Depression had started. So in 1931, when the Shadow first appeared, he realized there was another war to be waged on crime. Instead of a country, it was on crime itself. So that was his main goal. He basically became a soldier in a war against crime because he had experience with it. And his main cover identity, not his real identity, but his cover identity, was Lamont Cranston. And Lamont Cranston was this wealthy man about town who was a millionaire, but didn't do much around anywhere. Sort of like a certain socialite from Gotham City. That'll be important later. But he actually had a whole host of other disguises, like this businessman named Henry Arnault, this old guy named Isaac Twombly. He even posed as the janitor for the local police station as a German man named Fritz. So he had all this mastery of disguise. He could look like all these different people, and he used these identities to learn certain things about crime, either before or as it was happening. Now, the other big thing about the Shadow was that he did not work alone. He had agents. He had these agents that would work for him and essentially work as his foot soldiers against crime. The most well-known one is Harry Vincent. And this was the first agent readers were introduced to because he was in the first story, The Living Shadow. And essentially the Shadow saved him from committing suicide by jumping off a bridge. And the Shadow basically drafted him into the war on crime, saying, well, since I've saved your life, you have to use it for another purpose. And so he drafts him as one of his main agents against crime. There was also the agent Cliff Marsland, and his whole thing was that Cliff was a gangster. He had spent time in jail, but the Shadow used him as a mole because Cliff could get into these gangster groups and these criminal organizations without raising any alarm bells because he was a convicted felon himself. And so Cliff Marsland was basically his infiltrator to get into these criminal gangs. You also had Clyde Burke, who was like a news reporter from one of the many New York City newspapers. You had Mo Shrevnitz, who was a cab driver. Again, New York City, a job that nobody would bat an eye at. You had Rutledge Mann, who was an information broker whose day job was a stockbroker, but he basically worked as the go-between between the Shadow and many of his agents. Again, a stockbroker in New York City. That doesn't attract attention, so it's a perfect cover for a Shadow's agent. And the last one I'll mention is Burbank. And Burbank was the Shadow's radio operator. He was the one that was most often going between the Shadow and his agents because he was switching telephone lines, working by radio, and he was always kind of a mysterious figure. You didn't see him a whole lot. But he was the communications man, and he was very important to the Shadow's efforts. And going back to Lamont Cranston, the Shadow is not Lamont Cranston. There is a real Lamont Cranston in the Pulp stories, but the Shadow takes Lamont Cranston's identity because he's frequently away on other sides of the world because he's a world traveler, and nobody bats an eye at him being Lamont Cranston because nobody ever knows where Lamont Cranston really is. And one of the reasons the Shadow is posing as Lamont Cranston is that it gets him access to the police commissioner, whose name is Ralph Weston, and who is friends with Lamont Cranston. So, as Cranston, the Shadow has frequent access to information that most people would not have, given how he's buddy-buddy with the police commissioner. And one of the things I mentioned in this reprint I have is Chinatown stories. That's actually a big thing of the Shadow's character, is that he has a lot of connections to China. And a lot of the early Shadow stories dealt with him forging connections in Chinatown. And he's so revered by the Chinese that they actually call him Ying Ko, which in the Pulp stories means noble shadow. I looked it up somewhere, and apparently it doesn't quite mean that in real Mandarin, but again, it's a Pulp thing. That's the name they give him. So because of this, he has a lot of Chinese allies and Chinese villains. So that's a very big component of the Shadow's backstory. But I've been talking about a lot about his disguises, but his true identity, supposedly, is at a certain point in the Pulp's run, it was eventually revealed to be Kent Allard. And Kent Allard was a World War I flying ace who disappeared several years after the First World War and supposedly crashed in Central America. But he comes back to New York City after a couple of years and comes supposedly to reestablish himself. But supposedly Allard was the Shadow's true identity. I say supposedly because in one of the last Shadow stories, there was actually an implication that maybe Ken Allard was not the Shadow's true identity. Most people say it is. Most Shadow scholars say it is because it was portrayed that way for several years in the Shadow magazine. But there were some implications that maybe Allard was not the Shadow's true identity. So that was his general thing. Nobody really knew who he was, even when they thought they did. Now, when you talk about heroes, you always want to talk about their villains. And the Shadow definitely had some interesting villains. The one here, and this one, Greyfist, that right here, Greyfist was one of the Shadow's most prolific villains, because he was actually one of the ones that was able to track the Shadow down to his hiding place. The Shadow had a Sanctum that he kept all his files in and reconnoitered with Burbank via telephone with. But the Greyfist was one of the few Shadow villains that was able to find the Shadow Sanctum. That's also where the title of this series comes from, the Sanctum Files, because the Shadow had lots of files in his Sanctum. So Greyfist was an impressive villain, but he only appeared once. And that was kind of a recurring theme with the Shadow. He did not have many recurring enemies. For a very simple reason. Most of them died by the end of their stories. Because you got to remember, this is pulp fiction, not comic book fiction. With comic book fiction, there was almost always a prerogative of, well, if a bad guy's real popular, don't kill him off, or if you have to kill him off in a way where it's like ambiguous and he might have survived. And that was a thing going back all the way to some of the first comics, like Batman. If you read the first appearance of the Joker, the history of the first appearance of the Joker, and I believe it was Batman #1. You read that no, he was originally supposed to die, but the editor at the time of DC said, no, this is actually a cool character. Let's change a few panels at the end so that he's not quite dead. So that had been a thing with comic books since time immemorial. But Pulp Fiction did not have that. And the main reason was a lot of Pulp Fiction was disposable. It was not meant to be read and collected and curated like a lot of people did with comic books. It was meant to be read once and then tossed away. That was where the name Pulp Fiction came from, because it was made from pulp paste paper, not like slick clean paper. And pulp paste paper would break down and deteriorate much faster than like the slick magazines of like Collier's or Time or any of the bigger, more well-known magazines. So because of that, the Shadow's writers were not under any obligation to keep any of the villains alive. So most of them did not live to the end of their respective appearances. But that being said, there were a few who were recurring enemies. And there were 2 enemies that appeared 4 times in the magazine. The first one was Shiwan Khan. And Shiwan Khan was this Mongolian warlord who knew, like, hypnotism and ways to control people's minds. And he clashed with the Shadow because he wanted to take over the world. And, of course, the Shadow kept getting in his way. The second character who appeared 4 times was Benedict Stark, better known as the Prince of Evil. And his whole thing was that he was this multimillionaire who was this deeply ugly, repulsive business magnate, but who supposedly had a clean reputation, but was actually just as rotten on the inside as he was on the outside. And he launched these crimes of revenge upon people he thought were beneath him, or people he just wanted to mess with. And he was a real piece of work. And he appeared 4 times before his supposed end. One character who appeared 3 times, a villain that is, was Dr. Rodil Makino, otherwise known as the Voodoo Master. And as his name implies, he was a master of voodoo and hypnotizing people and getting people under his will. And he was one that popped up a fair number of times to challenge the Shadow, but he only appeared 3 times. Then there was a couple of 2-time appearances of villains. One was the Wasp. He was a guy who kind of looked like a wasp. That was his main thing, and he was blackmailing people. That was his main deal. Then there was Diamond Burt Falwell. And Diamond Burt actually appeared in the very first Shadow story, The Living Shadow, as one of the main villains. And he later came back. And that was actually he came back, I believe it was in the story The Chinese Discs. And Diamond Burt was actually supposedly the first time the Shadow's main writer, Walter B. Gibson, realized that, oh, wait, you can bring back a couple of villains. Let me try this again a few times. And that's where the Voodoo Master and Shiwan Khan kind of came from. Gibson realizing, occasionally you can bring a bad guy back. So that's kind of interesting. And those were individual villains, but the Shadow did a lot of fighting criminal organizations. The most famous one he fought was the Hand. Not the Marvel Comics group that Daredevil fights, but the Hand had 5 fingers, and each finger was a person who did a special kind of crime in a different city. And that was actually a story where the Shadow had to fight each finger of the Hand in 5 different stories. So that was kind of an interesting situation. But he also had some one-off criminal organizations he fought, like the Silent Seven, which was basically this sinister organization trying to control New York City's crime. The Hydra. The whole point of the Hydra is that if one of the criminal heads died, 2 other people would take his place. And the whole idea was that you cut off one head, 2 more appear. So again, kind of something that popped up in comic books later with Captain America, famously having Hydra. And you've got another group was called like the 5 Chameleons, and the whole point about them is that they can hide in plain sight. And basically their plan is to infiltrate banks, swap out the real money for counterfeit money, then leave town before anyone notices what's happening. But since they're chameleons, they easily disappear. So that was kind of the brand that the Shadow fought in terms of enemies. And what's interesting is that the Shadow initially started off fighting mostly criminal gangs. Like, they didn't have any flourishes. They were just like, Rocco Malone's gang or Diamond Burt's gang. There wasn't much in the way of, like, the bombastic flourish of a supervillain. They were just general gangsters. But as time went on and the Shadow fought a lot of gangsters, they eventually realized, oh, you know what? We should move on to some other characters. So the Shadow starts fighting mad scientists, he starts fighting enemy spies. Then he just starts fighting other costume figures. People like the aforementioned Greyface, the Black Falcon, the Cobra, and Blueface was another one. So his story sort of had an interesting escalation of fighting regular gangsters before moving up to like mad scientists and other costumed figures. So, again, very reflective of how the direction comic books would go. Not necessarily starting with more smaller stories before going into these bigger threats. So, that's another very cool thing about his history. So that's a general description of the Shadow as a character and his general description. But now I really want to talk about his publishing history, because his publishing history is really kind of fascinating and it's weirdly complex. So this is the thing that I think most people will be interested in, just to get sort of an idea of how the character was made. And it starts with a pulp publishing house named Street and Smith. Before comic book publishers, they were pulp publishers. And Street and Smith were one of the biggest ones. And they had a popular character named Nick Carter. Nick Carter was kind of an American Sherlock Holmes. And supposedly he actually appeared before Sherlock Holmes. So that's sort of an interesting factoid. And Nick Carter was big in the 1880s and the 1890s because he was published in dime novels. Dime novels were the predecessors to pulp magazines. And he'd been really popular, and they'd gotten lots of money and attention through him. But over the next couple decades, they hadn't had as big a success since him. You know, they'd been cruising along. They were doing, fine financial-wise, but nothing nearly as big as Nick Carter in the decades that followed. So in the late 1920s, crime magazines are all the rage in the pulp business. Black Mask is huge. The PI detectives are really taking over the pulp publishing scene. And Street and Smith created their own PI magazine called Detective Story Magazine. But supposedly it was doing okay, but it wasn't doing great. So Street and Smith decided, okay, we got to boost sales. How do we boost sales? They decided create a radio show, because this was 1930. This would have been 1930. And by this point, radio is huge. It'd been building through the 1920s, but by early 1930, radio is a huge establishment of American pop culture. So they're like, okay, we got to create a radio show. And they give it, since it's Detective Story Magazine, they call it Detective Story Hour. Simple. Sounds easy enough. And their idea is that we're just going to adapt stories from Detective Story Magazine to do Detective Story Hour. Okay, safe, easy to do. But then they realize we got to have an announcer. And the showrunners for the radio show go, well, you know what? We want to have an announcer with some real zing, because none of these stories are going to be connected. These are always going to be separate episodes with different characters and different scenarios. So we got to have a strong narrator, because he's going to be the one that people hear every week. And they put their minds together and they come up with a name for this narrator, and they call him the Shadow. And the whole thing about the Shadow is that he spoke in this deeply sinister voice. And he gave this evil laugh at the end of each episode, as all of the wrongdoers of each episode fell victim to their fates, or their guilt finally caught up to them. And he was he was not a loving fatherly figure that like said, "Oh, woe is the state of mankind that crime should happen this way." He was a sinister figure who was basically laughing at these people as they were dragged off to their punishments. And again, you got to remember, this is right in the middle of the Great Depression. Prohibition is still going on, so there's rampant corruption, there's rampant joblessness, crime is at its all-time high. So people were not as interested in like the cozy fatherly, oh, we can prevail through this. They were interested in sort of a punishing, avenging angel, and that's kind of how the Shadow was portrayed in the Detective Story Hour. And so they released Detective Story Hour, and the radio show, it's a success. It's a smash hit. Everybody's listening to it. And initially you think, oh, Street and Smith will be happy that they're getting all this attention. But there's just a big problem. People are not interested in Detective Story magazine. They are interested in the Shadow magazine, because everybody got really fascinated by this Shadow announcer character that they go, oh, let's go out and look for the Shadow magazine, because they're mentioning this magazine that ties into this radio show. So everybody was looking for the Shadow magazine instead of Detective Story magazine. So they were in a bit of a pickle because, everyone was interested in the Shadow and no one really cared about that Detective Story magazine thing. And so you would think that initially Street and Smith would want to like rectify the error, like just go on the radio say, no guys, it's the Detective Story magazine. But instead they realize they have a gold mine on their hands, because people are really interested in the Shadow. That means they can find a new character to do another property with. But there's just one problem. They have the copyright to the Detective Story Hour, but they don't have the copyright to the Shadow because they didn't actually copyright him when they were doing it. And because he has such a simplistic name, the Shadow, if you didn't have a copyright for that, anybody could come and make a Shadow character. So you decide, okay, we got to get a Shadow magazine out. We need to get it out ASAP. And because we need it ASAP, we need a real fast writer. And just as it so happened, there was a writer who was in the Street and Smith editorial office named Walter B. Gibson. And he was there to sell some stories and articles that he was working on. And Street and Smith said, hey, Gibson, can you write this a few quick Shadow stories? They initially gave him about 4, I believe, because it was going to be a quarterly magazine. So they asked for 4 right off the bat. And Gibson was a very established individual in the pulp field, because he had been a newspaper man before he worked in the pulp business for some Philadelphia newspapers. He had been the head writer and editor of some magic magazines, because Walter B. Gibson was a magician. And this turned out to be a perfect fit, because not only could Gibson write fast, but he was able to do magical flourishes and disappearing acts with the Shadow that was very useful as a crime fighter. So because of that, Gibson says yes, and in early 1931 he finishes the story. And he sits on the other stories because they're due quarterly, he can write them fast, whatever. But that first story goes out and it's a smash hit. The April 1931 issue, it sells out immediately. And when they do another printing, that sells out. And so initially they're like, oh, well, they're keeping to a quarterly. But by October of 1931, they change it to a monthly because they ask Gibson, hey, can you write a Shadow story once a month? And he said, sure. And so they kept it that way for a year. But even the monthly issues of the Shadow magazine were selling out. They were going hugely fast. And so by October of 1932, one whole year later, they asked him, Gibson, can you write 2 Shadow stories a month? And keep in mind, these were not 2 short stories. These were 2 roughly novel-length works, like around 50,000 words each. And Gibson goes, sure. The way Gibson put in one of the interviews, I remember saying, it's the Great Depression. This was solid money at the time. He was like, yeah, I wasn't going to turn down this job. And so Gibson starts writing all these Shadow stories, 24 a year, and often more than that, because he liked to get ahead of a lot of things and write as many stories as he could. Gibson starts writing for a couple of years. He's writing over 1 million words a year. Not just for like 1 year, but for like 3 or 4 years. He's writing it 1 million words a year. And it's an insane output that nobody has ever really matched since. So you've got this twice a month publication. And the Pulp magazine is very successful. It goes from 1931 to 1949. Now, towards the end of its run, it does start decreasing in circulation because when World War II happens, that really interferes with the paper usage. And so in March 1943, it goes back to a monthly magazine. Then by 1947, they go to doing it once every 2 months. And finally, by the 1948, it's back to being what it was originally, a quarterly magazine, 4 issues a year. And it was kind of this sad, gradual reversal of its initial success. Things started tapering off and, it gradually went away. But while it was running, it was hugely successful. One interesting thing is that Walter B. Gibson was the main writer. He wrote most of the Shadow stories, but there were a few other writers who were involved in writing them. One was the second writer named Theodore Tinsley, and he was hired in 1936 because Street and Smith wanted to make sure Walter Gibson didn't get burned out when he wrote these stories. And they hired Tinsley to basically help him out and write 4 stories a year for the Shadow, which basically meant that there were 2 months where Gibson could, maybe be lackadaisical. He didn't have to worry about 2 months out of the year. And Tinsley wrote the Shadow a little differently. The Shadow was a little more hard-edged. He was a little more willing to have violence and sexuality in his stories compared to Gibson, because Gibson was a little more traditional, didn't go as much in for shock value, but Theodore Tinsley did. He was a little more hardcore in his portrayal of the Shadow. Some people don't like him. I enjoy Tinsley's stuff because it is noticeably different to Gibson's, but I think it works for the Shadow. He doesn't go so far that I think he forgets the Shadow's point. But Tinsley was there from 1936 to 1943 because once he left the magazine, once it went back to being a once-a-month publication, because then they didn't really need him to supplant Walter Gibson's stuff. And he went and joined the Office of War Information because, again, it was the middle of World War II, so they needed men. There's also the one writer who is not held in much esteem because from 1946 to 1948, Walter Gibson left Street and Smith over a contract dispute regarding the Shadow. And they had another writer come in to replace him named Bruce Elliott. And Bruce Elliott was a magician too. But Elliott's stories were not really well received because he was writing like these cosmopolitan mysteries of the Shadow, these very highbrow sort of tales, which didn't really gel with the pulp reading audience. A lot of people even today really don't like the stories. Some of them I think work, a lot of them don't though. I'm not as harsh on Elliot, but a lot of his stories were duds. And fortunately, Gibson returned for the last 5 stories of the Shadow magazine that went from 1948 to 1949. So he was able to finish what he started, essentially, with that. And that is the history of the Pulp magazine. That was pretty much what went on with the Pulp magazine from its beginning to its end. But some of you are probably going, well, wait. You mentioned the Shadow radio show, but that last radio show you talked about wasn't the Shadow. That was the Detective Story Hour. Well, that's one thing I'm going to get to right now. See, because the Shadow Pulp magazine was so popular, Street and Smith realized, oh, we should make a Shadow radio show. But weirdly enough, they did it at least twice, I know of, to try and get a Shadow radio show off the ground throughout the early and mid 1930s, but for one reason or another, they just couldn't really succeed until 1937, when they finally get the right sponsors, and more specifically, they get the right actor, because they happen to get a fairly well-known theater actor who was big in New York at the time. You guys might have heard of him. His name was Orson Welles. And Orson Welles was very prolific as a theater actor, and he'd done radio work for his theater, the Mercury Theater. So he had some experience with radio as well as stage acting. And he was the first Shadow voice for this particular Shadow radio show. He wasn't the first Shadow. Obviously, the other voice actors who were in Detective Story Hour were the first Shadow, but he was the first Shadow for this iteration of the character. And Wells actually was not on it very long. He was only on it for 2 or 3 seasons. And starting in 1938, these other actors came in to voice the Shadow, and the radio show was hugely popular and went even past the Pulp magazine. The Pulp magazine ended in 1949. The radio show went all the way to 1954. Around the time radio had started dying off from competition from television. And despite the fact that Wells was not on the show all that long, it was a really influential run, because that was kind of what helped propel Wells into the stratosphere of stardom, and some people have argued that's kind of what led him to be able to have the clout to go over to Hollywood and make his magnum opus Citizen Kane. So it was a very influential show in that regard, and apparently there were rumors that Orson Welles in the 40s actually wanted to play the Shadow in a cinematic outing. He wanted to play the Shadow in cinema. That never came to be, but it's interesting to think about. And one of the important things about the radio show is that it introduced the phrase, "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men?" Because the Shadow knows, and the response was always, "The Shadow knows." The Shadow knows had been established in the Pulp magazine, so the radio didn't invent that, but what evil lurks in the hearts of men, that was apparently the radio show invention. and it's been a huge part of the Shadow's mythology since. One of the biggest differences between the Pulp magazine and the radio show was that the radio show was simplified, and specifically the Shadow was stated to be Lamont Cranston. He wasn't an imposter, he was Lamont Cranston. And they did this to simplify things because they thought that the whole thing of the Master of Disguise element of the Pulp magazine would be a little hard to follow on radio. Because after all, you can't see or read what a person is doing on radio. They also decide, well, you can't be a Master of Disguise, so we're going to add to the Shadow that he has the power to cloud men's minds. He has these hypnotic and telepathic powers that can make people not see him or make them see things that aren't there. And that was a big thing because the Shadow did not have those powers in the Pulp magazine. He was just a regular guy who had all these magician type techniques to hide or distract people. But the radio Shadow had legitimate powers, legitimate telepathic and hypnotic powers. Also, another thing they changed was that the Shadow did not use guns. He did not have his dual-wielded Colt 45s. Instead, he used his hypnotic powers to trick criminals into either being captured or ending up in situations that caused their doom. And that was another significant change. The Shadow didn't directly cause deaths like he did in the Pulp magazines. He just kind of manipulated things so that happened. The other big thing that was an important addition to the Shadow radio show was Margot Lane. And Margot Lane was essentially Lamont's girlfriend, though in the show they call her friend and companion. And supposedly that was a bit of a censorship thing because initially Margot was explicitly Lamont's fiancée, but supposedly there were some censorship issues that they said, okay, tone it down so that, she's just a friend, despite the fact she's a beautiful woman going around with this rich, handsome guy. But there's nothing going on between them. Don't worry about that. Apparently it was even a joke among the radio writers and cast. They're like, yeah, we all know what they're doing between episodes. That's not me being dirty. That's in the Shadow histories. But so she's his friend and companion. And the whole thing was she accompanied him on his adventures. And she was created because they wanted to have someone for the Shadow to talk to, but they didn't want him to have a male agent because there wasn't enough vocal contrast. I mean, you'd think there would be, considering Orson Welles was voicing him and nobody sounds like Orson Welles, but they said, no, we want a woman to play Margot Lane and be this female character the Shadow talks to, just so there'll be different voices. So that was how Margot Lane came into the Shadow's mythology. And the radio show also tended to be a little more willing to get into the fantastical. The Shadow Pulp magazines generally had grounded explanations for whatever crime was happening. The Shadow radio show would go straight up into like ghosts and vampires, werewolves, and it wouldn't be like, oh, they were faking it the whole time. It would be like, no, these were actual ghosts and werewolves and zombies and vampires. So that was another significant difference from the radio show from the Pulp magazine. And this is kind of the weird thing about the radio show, is that the radio show got so popular it actually started influencing the pulp magazines, because Margot Lane became such a prominent character in the radio show and was so entwined with the Shadow that a lot of people went to the pulp magazines and started going, hey, where's Margot in this? Because she wasn't in the pulp magazines. And eventually in 1941, they finally put Margot into the pulp magazine. Supposedly Gibson wasn't a fan of that because he wrote Margot Lane as a bit of a ditz who always got captured. Some people have said he wasn't that angry at her. He just didn't know what to do with her. But there are some people that say no, he was annoyed that he had to put her in, so he just wrote her as an annoying ditz. I kind of lean more towards that explanation because a lot of the Margot Lane pulp stories are a little they're not very nice towards Margot, so I always kind of have a suspicion about that. But and this was kind of the double-edged sword of the radio show being popular, because after the 1940s, more people were familiar with the Shadow radio show than the Pulp magazine. And because of that, there was sort of this thing where the radio show iteration kind of blocked out the Pulp version, even though the Pulp version is the one that really made them popular. And it's actually kind of similar to what happened with Tarzan, because if you know anything about the Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan films, you'll know that there was a lot of perception of Tarzan were formed by those movies, even though they were very different from the original Edgar Rice Burroughs stories. And that was sort of a similar thing with the Shadow radio show. A lot of people started thinking of the Shadow as his radio version and not his pulp version. So that was kind of an interesting development in his history. So, okay, it's a successful pulp magazine. It's a successful radio show. That's probably where it stopped, right? No. The Shadow was huge during the 30s, but also during the 1940s, because Walter Gibson also wrote a 2-year-long Shadow comic strip for newspapers with an artist named Vernon Green, and they did that for 2 years. But then Gibson also wrote many issues of the Shadow comic book that Street and Smith started printing, and that ran from March 1940s to September 1949 for 101 issues. It was fairly popular, and not just that comic strip and comic book, but there were actually a lot of Shadow films made in the 30s and 40s. 2 starred an actor named Rod LaRoque. 3 of them starred an actor named Kane Richmond, I believe his name was. And there was actually one film serial made of the Shadow in 1940. A film serial was basically the predecessor to television, where there would be these episodes of a character that would play for about 10 minutes before the main feature. Obviously, they don't exist anymore because we have television, but that was how it was done in the 1940s. And the Shadow in that one was played by Victor Jory, who was this fairly well-known character actor. And a lot of Shadow fans consider that film serial to be the best cinematic depiction of the Shadow. So the Shadow is absolutely huge in the 30s and 40s. There is Shadow mania, you could say. And everything's going well until the Pulp magazine folds, because in 1949, for a variety of issues, that folds. The comic book also folds. The radio show goes for 5 more years, but eventually that folds too. So, to everything, there's a season. So, okay, the Pulp's gone by 1949, and the radio show is gone by 1954. Uh, because of that, the Shadow's out of the limelight for several years. There are like there are two attempts to do a Shadow TV show, and they just don't go anywhere. People don't buy it. One TV show is done in 1954. Only one episode is produced. Nobody buys. No sponsor gets into it, so it doesn't go anywhere. Then another one happens in 1958, and it's meant to be a two-part television pilot, but nobody buys the rights, and so they just combine into a film to release into theaters titled The Invisible Avenger. And eventually, this film, 4 years later in 1962, gets re-edited into a sleazy exploitation flick called Bourbon Street Shadows, which doesn't mention the fact that it's a shadow film. That just advertises the fact that there's a lot of scantily clad women. So that was kind of the nadir of the Shadow's place in history, because his films are being edited into sleazy exploitation flicks rather than being advertised as shadow films. So that was kind of the nadir of the Shadow's place in pop cultural history. But the 60s is actually when things do start to pick up for the Shadow, because by this point, radio is pretty much gone. Television has taken over. So, but there's a lot of nostalgia for radio. And this one guy started replaying the radio episodes on local college stations, because all the college students there in the 60s were kids in the 40s and 50s and grew up listening to The Shadow. So they get a lot of airplay on college radio stations. And then another bombshell happens when this publishing group called Belmont Books, who was this very big publishing house, starts releasing new Shadow stories. The very first one, Return of the Shadow, was the only one done by Walter Gibson. The rest were done by another writer named Dennis Lenz, because Gibson didn't like the pay rate that Belmont Books was giving him. So that series sort of starts and stops, and, that's it. But this is kind of what the Shadow needs to get the kick in the pants he needs to start getting back into, maybe not the limelight, but some kind of light, because he starts really appearing in comic books, and comic books kind of become his main domain from the 1960s to really today, because since he was such an influence on different comic book characters, particularly Batman, some would say Batman was a little too inspired by the Shadow. There's a thing about how the Batman's very first story was, if you're being nice, you say a takeoff on a Shadow story. If you're being mean, you say a plagiarism of a Shadow story. I'm a bit mean, so I call it plagiarism, but yeah, Batman was heavily influenced by him, but tons of other heroes had some sort of influence from him. And so, because of that, the Shadow really finds his place in comic books. And he goes into a lot of different publishers. He's in Archie Comics, DC Comics, the late, great Dark Horse Comics. May they rest in peace. But yeah, he really finds his footing there in comic books, and that's where, except for like the last 5 or 6 years, he's been largely in popular culture in these comic books. There was also a big budget Shadow film released in 1994, starring Alec Baldwin as the Shadow. And that was a version that was kind of an amalgamation of the Shadow in pulps, radio, and comics. because one thing is that a lot of the later day comics would kind of mix and match things from the Shadow Pulp stories and the Shadow radio show, some more than others, but it was a common thing for a lot of later Shadow comics. And the 1994 Shadow film comes out. In fact, I actually have my copy of it right here. And it doesn't do great. It really underperforms. But it becomes a big part of the Shadow's legacy. That's how a lot of people from my generation learned about the Shadow. So it's important in that regard. And aside from comics, the Shadow has influenced works like V for Vendetta. If you've seen V in that comic series, you look at him and go, oh yeah, that's the Shadow. That's totally a Shadow look. The Disney series Darkwing Duck, because you see his hat and the kind of cape Darkwing Duck has, and plus his real identity is Drake Mallard, which is a play on Kent Allard. So a very explicit reference there. The character Spawn, the comic book character Spawn, has a lot of Shadow elements from the fact that he uses a lot of guns while having this dark crimson cape and burning eyes. That was another thing the Shadow had. He had these burning eyes that would bore into your head. And for video game fans, Fallout 4 had a character called the Silver Shroud, who was basically a portrayal of the radio version of the Shadow. So he's had a huge influence, even though he's not been in the limelight necessarily for many of the past decades. So, why is the Shadow not as well known today as many people would expect him to be? Well, the simple reason is that because of all the guys he's influenced, his attention has kind of been diverted from him, because all the others people have seen these characters like Batman and Darkwing Duck and Spawn and gone, oh, well, this is like those characters, instead of thinking, no, these characters got all that stuff from him. So that's one reason. The other reason is that it's actually not that easy to get a lot of Shadow media. Because, for instance, this Sanctum reprint I'm showing here, this stopped being produced in the 2020s. It stopped being produced since the James Patterson Shadow started. And this was the only series that had a virtually complete collection. There were only I think 5 or 6 stories that were never fully reprinted in this series. So this was a near complete one, but it hasn't been reprinted, and a lot of these books are really hard to find nowadays. Even now, even though it's only 6 years later, these are still hard to find. And there were a couple of other pulp publishers who reprinted Shadow stories, but they didn't republish them very often, and they often didn't republish a good portion of them, because remember, Walter Gibson wrote hundreds of these. I think the number, if I'm remembering correctly, was somewhere around 250. And that's not including the ones that Theodore Tinsley and Bruce Elliott wrote. So there's a lot of these stories that just have not been reprinted often. And on top of that, the radio show, there's a lot of radio episodes that are missing. I can't put an exact percentage on it, but there are a lot of Shadow radio episodes that are just gone. And because of that, there's a lot of Shadow radio episodes you can't hear. And even a lot of his comic book series are not collected. one that was made in the 1970s had a partial collection, but not a full collection. There was this famous Shadow comic book series called The Shadow Strikes that went for dozens of issues from DC in the late 80s to the early 90s, but it too was never given a collection. So a lot of these comics you have to buy individually in order to get them, which is not like Marvel and DC where you can buy full omnibuses for a lot of their series, and you can just find them on Amazon. And even his films, like the 1994 Shadow film has been given re-releases, but all the ones done in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there's nothing. You have to find those on bootleg DVDs that are all kind of crummy quality, and it's just sad. There's a lot of Shadow stuff, but nobody's maintaining it or giving people easy access to it. So that's a real big reason I think he's not as in the limelight as he could have been. And it's very strange because this wasn't the treatment that Doc Savage, who was another Street and Smith pulp character, got. Doc Savage got a lot of attention. He had all of his stories reprinted in paperback. So even though the pulp magazines went out of fashion, the Doc Savage stories were still very much in paperback print, and they are widely available and pretty easy to get. So it's just a thing where, the Shadow should be much bigger, but due to shenanigans by the copyright holders, just hasn't really been taken advantage of. So that's kind of a bummer. But to close out with some recommendations about Shadows, what Shadow media you should get. I highly recommend, if you can find them, any of these Sanctum reprints. They're hard to find nowadays, but if you can find them, they're absolutely worth it, because it's not just the stories. They actually have the original illustrations inside them, and there's frequently essays by Will Murray and Anthony Tolan in here talking about these different stories. So these are very cool if you can find them. So I recommend that. Video-wise, if you want to learn more about the Shadow, I highly recommend checking out Razor Fist's videos on the Shadow comics and media. They do a good job talking about the Shadow media, and they can list other media you might be interested in regarding the Shadow. In regards to me, Shadow material that I would recommend checking out, the ones I got, the one I really recommend is the 1973 DC series. This was done by what was his name? He was a famous comic book writer, Denny O'Neil. Denny O'Neil did most of this series. An artist named Michael Kaluta did a lot of this, and he did a great job. So if you can check out the 73 DC series, that's a very good one. If you're looking for a more modern one, Denny O'Neil and Michael Kaluta did a Shadow graphic novel in the 80s titled 1941, The Shadow, Hitler's Astrologer. And this is a fun one, great art, and a very strong story. I highly recommend this one. I also think, though Dark Horse is sadly not really with us anymore, if you can find any of Dark Horse's Shadow books, this one is Hell's Heat Wave. This one is In the Coils of Leviathan. They're both very good. If you can find any of the Dark Horse Shadow comics, they're well worth your time. I would also say, if you want like a good basic all-encompassing adaptation, the 1994 Shadow film is a decent enough one. Some people really don't like it, but I enjoy it because it's kind of a mixture of the Shadow's iterations. So, yeah, if you want to just have a decent enough introduction, this one would be fine. Two Shadow media I would say you should avoid are the James Patterson Shadow books and the Archie comic books. You'll want to avoid the James Patterson Shadow books because, to put it bluntly, they're not very good. He doesn't really write the Shadow as the Shadow. There's a lot of weird plot points. It's just not really well put together. So it's not a good representation of the Shadow. And the Archie comic books were the ones done in the 60s. That was where they kind of made the Shadow campier. He wore a goofy outfit. He started fighting like legitimate comic book villains, and it was just it wasn't really fitting for the Shadow, so I don't recommend that one. All right, well, I've talked about the Shadow long enough. I hope this has interested some of you. Uh, I am going to do a couple more videos regarding the Shadow in the weeks to come, both before and after PulpFest, so keep your eyes open for that. And check out the Shadowed Circle. I'll leave the link to our Facebook and website in the description. And yeah, I hope I've interested you guys in the Shadow, and I hope that you find a new character you enjoy. So, thank you very much for listening, and I will catch you guys later. Bye.